Hello there, and welcome. Whether you're settling in for the night or just letting your mind wander somewhere beyond the everyday, I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for. You right now. Are you watching the sunset, or is it already deep into night? Are you in a city or somewhere more quieter? Tonight, we're going to explore something strange, something that doesn't quite add up when you really think about it. Picture this. For most of human life on Earth, nearly 200,000 years, we were here fully modern, fully capable, walking around with brains basically the same as the ones you're using right now to understand these words. The same brain size, the same brain parts, the same ability for language, for thinking, about complicated things, for imagining stuff that don't exist and then making them real. And yet, for most of those 200,000 years, we did almost nothing with all that ability. We survived for sure. We did well in our own way. We moved across lands, followed animal herds, gathered plants, made simple tools. We lived in small groups, raised kids, told stories around fires, dealt with tricky social stuff. We were human in every real way, but we didn't build cities. We didn't farm. We didn't write. We didn't make temples that would last thousands of years, or create art galleries in limestone caves, or come up with math or deep thinking or any of the things we now connect with human civilization. We just were. For thousands and thousands of generations, we simply were. And then, in what looks like a second on the Earth's clock, everything changed. If this kind of slow exploring speaks to you, I'd be grateful if you tapped like or subscribed. Suddenly, and I mean suddenly in the timescale of human history, there were settlements, farming, complicated societies, buildings that still stand today, writing systems, trade networks, social levels, specialized jobs, cities rising from river valleys, temples climbing toward the sky. It happened so fast in Earth time that it seems almost impossible. Like someone flipped a switch somewhere in the human mind and everything that had been sleeping suddenly woke up all at once. But switches don't flip themselves. Something had to change. Some condition had to shift. Some line had to be crossed. And the mystery isn't what we became. That part is obvious. We can see it in the ruins, in the old objects, in the written records. The mystery is why it took so long and then happened so quickly. What was the delay? What was the trigger? What invisible thing kept us in a kind of pause for nearly all of our life and then led us into this waterfall of change? This isn't a story about aliens or lost knowledge or some big supernatural thing happening. There's no need for that. The real story is stranger and more beautiful than any made-up story. It's about us, about the missing link in human history. Not the biological link between apes and humans. That one we found carefully dug up from ancient dirt, studied in labs, traced through DNA. This is a different kind of missing link. The thinking link, the social link, the invisible, untouchable shift that turned capable beings into builders of civilization. It's the moment when something clicked, when the pieces that had been there all along suddenly arranged themselves into a new shape, and once they did, there was no going back. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift to the pace of deep time, where 1,000 years is barely a moment, and 100,000 years is just a chapter. We're going to walk together through this puzzle, not rushing to answers, not demanding certainty, just noticing the patterns, the clues, the strange and wonderful timing of it all. Because understanding why civilization showed up when it did, why it took the shape it did, might tell us something important about what we are and what we might still become. Or maybe it will just give us a deeper love for the strangeness of being human at all, for the unlikely journey that brought us from stone tools to satellites in what amounts to a heartbeat of Earth time. When we think about human history, we tend to imagine a steady upward climb from caves to huts to cities to skyscrapers. A smooth move forward. Each generation building on the last, advancing, improving, getting better at being human. But that's not what happened, not even close. The real story is stranger and way more patient than we usually admit. It's a story that needs us to really sit with the weight of time to feel how long 200,000 years actually is. Modern humans, People with bodies and brains basically the same as ours, first showed up in Africa somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. The fossils are there. Skulls found in Morocco, in Ethiopia, in South Africa. When scientists measure these skulls, when they rebuild the brains that once filled them, they find brain sizes within the same range as modern humans. 1,400 cubic centimeters, give or take. That's our size. That's our brain. These weren't half humans or experiments halfway between something else and us. They were us. They had the same ability for complicated thought, the same voice box that allows for detailed speech, the same hands able to do tricky work, the same eyes that can track patterns and read faces and see beauty and balance. They had everything we have physically, brain-wise. The equipment was complete. And what did they do with all that ability? Very little, at least very little that left a mark we can still see. For most of those 200,000 years, humans lived in small moving groups, bands of maybe 20 to 50 people, sometimes gathering with others for seasonal events or shared resources, but mostly moving, always moving, following animals as they moved, tracking water as it appeared and disappeared with the seasons, reading landscapes with a closeness we can barely imagine now, knowing every plant, every animal track, every stone that might make a good tool. They made tools. Yes, stone tools. Some of them quite fancy, showing real skill, real understanding of how stone breaks, how to shape it, how to create a sharp edge or a pointed tip. The Acheulean hand axe, for instance, was amazing Stone Age work. Balanced, elegant, useful. But here's the thing. That same basic design lasted for over a million years. Let that sink in. The same tool made the same way, used for the same purposes across thousands and thousands of generations. Not because people weren't capable of new ideas. Not because they lacked smarts or creativity, but because new ideas wasn't necessary, or maybe it wasn't possible yet. Not in the way we think of it now. When your life is about immediate survival, when resources are scattered and unpredictable, when every day needs your full attention just to find enough food and water and shelter, there's not a lot of room for trying new things. There's not a lot of extra stuff, mental or physical, to put into projects that might work later or might not work at all. There's something deeply strange about this long, flat part. It challenges our ideas about progress, about human nature, about what makes change happen. Try to imagine it in human terms, squeezed into a scale we can understand. If you took all of human life and squeezed it into a single 24-hour day, we would have spent 23 hours and 40 minutes doing basically the same thing. Living in small groups, making similar tools, following similar patterns. And then, in the last 20 minutes, we would have invented farming, writing, cities, math, deep thinking, metalworking, the wheel, sailing ships, printing presses, electricity, computers, space travel, everything. All of it in those final 20 minutes. The squeezing is almost silly. It raises uncomfortable questions. Were we not smart enough before? Did our brains need to change more? Did something change in our brain wiring that made civilization suddenly possible? The answer, according to the fossil record and genetic studies, is no. Our brains were ready. Physically, brain-wise, we had everything we needed. The ability was there. The possibility was there. So why the wait? What was missing? What invisible ingredient kept all that possibility locked away for so long and then suddenly let it out? It wasn't equipment. The evidence is clear on that. It was something else. Software. Maybe the cultural knowledge, the built-up wisdom, the ways of thinking that allow complicated societies to work. Or it was conditions, the environmental stuff that makes settled life possible and good. Or it was permission in a sense, the stability and extra stuff that give people the freedom to think beyond immediate survival, to plan for futures they might not live to see, to put time into projects that won't work out for generations. Or, and this seems more and more likely, it was some mix of all three. A perfect storm of things that had to line up in just the right way at just the right time. Because the flat part wasn't empty. That's important to understand. People lived full lives during those long thousands of years. They weren't waiting for civilization. They weren't incomplete or unfulfilled. They loved and feared and celebrated and grieved. They raised kids and mourned the dead. They made complicated languages, though we'll never hear them. They told stories, though we'll never know what they were about. They dealt with tricky social relationships, formed bonds, made choices, felt joy and sadness and everything in between. They were not less human than we are, not less smart, not less worthy. They were just living in a different mode, one where survival was the main task and extra stuff was rare. And in that mode, they were really successful. Think about what it took just to survive. They had to know the landscape closely. Which plants were good to eat and when, which animals could be hunted and how, where water would be during the dry season, how to read the weather, the stars, the small signs that meant change was coming. They had to make tools without instruction. Books, passing knowledge down through showing and practice. They had to raise kids in a world where danger was constant and help was limited to what the group could give. They had to keep social peace without police or laws or written rules, relying instead on custom, reputation, and the careful balance of give and take. This needed intelligence, serious, fancy intelligence, memory, pattern spotting, social awareness, communication, problem solving. All the thinking abilities we pride ourselves on today, where they're being used every day, just pointed toward different ends, and it worked. For thousands of generations it worked. People survived. Groups grew slowly, but steadily. Humans spread across Africa and eventually out of it into Asia, into Europe, into climates and landscapes really different from where the species first came from. They adapted. They learned. They kept going, but they didn't settle. They didn't pile things up. They didn't build things meant to last beyond a season or a generation. And for most of that time, there was no reason to. The world they lived in rewarded moving, not staying put. It rewarded flexibility, not doing one thing really well. It rewarded quick responses, not long-term planning. And so that's what they did. They moved, they adapted, they survived. And then something changed. For decades, the story we told ourselves about how civilization started went like this. First, humans discovered farming. They figured out how to plant seeds, take care of crops, and tame animals. This made extra food, which let people settle in one place. Settlements grew into villages, villages into towns, towns into cities. With permanent settlements came doing specific jobs. Not everyone had to farm. Some could become craftspeople, priests, builders, leaders. Social levels appeared. Religion became organized. Big buildings were put up to honor gods or remember the dead. Writing was invented to keep track of stuff and debts, and so civilization was born. It was a neat story. Farming revolution leads to settlement. Settlement leads to extra stuff. Extra stuff leads to being complicated. Cause and effect. Straight and logical. And then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a place in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found there didn't just challenge the story. It flipped it upside down. Göbekli Tepe is a hilltop covered in huge stone buildings, circular spaces, each one marked by enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 50 tons. These pillars are carved with detailed pictures of animals, lions, foxes, snakes, scorpions, birds. The skill is amazing, fancy, careful. Clearly the work of people who understood balance, planning, and symbols. But here's the thing. The place dates to around 9600 BCE, that's over 11,000 years ago. And the people who built it were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. There is no proof of tamed grains at Göbekli Tepe during its main time of use. No signs of permanent housing in the early parts. No pottery, no villages, nothing that fits the normal model of settled farming life. Instead, it appears that groups of moving foragers came together seasonally or sometimes to build these huge spaces. They carved the pillars from bedrock, moved then to the place, put them up in exact patterns, feasted, did rituals, and then left. Over time, they would return, build new spaces, and eventually, for reasons we still don't understand, carefully bury the older ones under tons of rubble. This changes everything. Because if hunter-gatherers could organize work on this scale, plan complicated building projects, and gather in large groups for shared symbolic purposes, then farming wasn't the trigger for social being complicated. It might have been the other way around. Maybe the need to support these gatherings to feed the people who came together for rituals and building actually pushed the adoption of farming. Maybe religion came first. Maybe the urge to gather, to build something lasting, to create a place that mattered came before the practical new ideas of food making. And if that's true, then the missing link isn't about tools or farming ways. It's about something deeper. It's about the moment when humans started to think in symbols, when they began to imagine and create things that had no immediate survival value, but carried meaning. Göbekli Tepe suggests that this ability, this shift in awareness happened before we settled down, that we were already building symbolic worlds in our minds long before we built permanent homes for our bodies. And once that ability was there, once humans could think of shared identities, group purposes and futures worth planning for, farming became not just possible, but something that had to happen. Because you can't build Göbekli Tepe and stay nomadic forever. Eventually, the practical stuff catches up. You need a more reliable food source, a way to support the gatherings, to feed the workers, to keep going the community that forms around the sacred place. And so farming begins not as a sudden discovery, but as a slow, almost reluctant change to the demands of a new kind of social life. The Neolithic Revolution, as it's often called, wasn't really a revolution at all. Not in the sense of something that happened quickly or all at once. It was more like a slow burn, a bunch of experiments, some successful, some not, spread across thousands of years and multiple places. Farming didn't begin in one place and spread like wildfire. It appeared separately in at least a dozen different places around the world. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, the highlands of New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa. Each place made its own crops, its own methods, its own timeline, and nowhere did. It happened overnight. In the Fertile Crescent, the process began around 10,000 BCE. People started noticing that wild grains, barley and wheat grew a lot in certain areas after the Ice Age ended and the climate got stable. At first, they simply harvested these wild grains. They didn't plant them. They just returned to the same patches year after year, gathering what grew naturally. Over time, they began to protect these patches, maybe clearing competing plants, maybe watering them during dry times. This wasn't farming yet. It was proto-farming, a kind of managing of wild resources. Then slowly, they started picking seeds from the best plants and planting them in new areas. This made a feedback loop. The more they planted, the more the plants got used to being grown. Wild wheat shatters when it's ripe, dropping its seeds to the ground. That's great for the plant's babies, but terrible for human harvesters. But every so often, a change would happen. A plant whose seeds didn't shatter, whose grains stayed on the stalk until someone came to collect them. Humans chose to harvest and replant these mutants. Over generations, tamed wheat came out, a plant that was now dependent on humans for making babies, just as humans were becoming dependent on it for food. The same process happened with animals. Wild goats and sheep were slowly herded, picked for calmness, and bred in ways that made them easier to manage. Cattle, pigs, chickens all followed similar paths. But this took time, centuries, thousands of years even, and it wasn't a one-way street. People didn't give up foraging the moment they started planting seeds. For a long time they did both. They played it safe. They planted crops, but still hunted, still gathered wild foods, still moved seasonally between resources. The change wasn't smooth or something that had to happen. It was messy, experimental, full of setbacks. Early farming communities often had worse food than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their diets were less different. They suffered more from sicknesses, especially those passed by tamed animals. Their teeth rotted from eating more carbs. Their skeletons show signs of harder work, doing the same thing over and over, shorter heights. So why did they keep doing it? Because farming, for all its bad sides, offered one big advantage. It could support more people in a smaller area. You could store grain. You could plan ahead. You could survive droughts or bad hunting seasons by relying on your stores. And as groups grew, the option to return to foraging became less and less doable. There simply wasn't enough wild game or wild plants to support larger groups. Farming became a trap, but a productive one. And once you were in it, you couldn't easily get out. By around 8000 BCE, true farming communities were set up in the Fertile Crescent. Permanent villages showed up, some with hundreds of people. Mud brick houses, storage pits, grinding stones, the stuff of settled life, and with that came new social structures, new levels, new ways of organizing work and giving out resources. But even then, it wasn't everywhere. Some groups resisted farming for thousands of years, keeping their moving lifestyles, their equal social structures, their deep knowledge of wild landscapes. Farming spread unevenly, sometimes through moving, sometimes through copying, sometimes through taking over. It wasn't better in every sense, but it was more suited to certain conditions, certain environments, certain moments in time. And once it took hold, it changed everything. So if farming was a slow process and if symbolic thinking might have come before it, what was the real shift? What was the thinking change that made civilization possible? This is where things get fascinating and frustratingly unclear, because we're not talking about something you can dig up or date with carbon. We're talking about changes in how people thought, how they processed information, how they imagined the world, and those things leave only indirect traces. The main idea is something called the cognitive revolution, though it's worth saying up front that not all scientists agree it happened as a single event or even that it happened at all. Some argue it was gradual. Others say the ability was always there, just waiting for the right conditions to show itself. But the main idea is this. At some point, humans got the ability to think in symbols and abstract ways that other animals, even other human-like species, could not. Symbolic thinking means being able to represent one thing with another. A word for an object, a drawing for an animal, a mark on a cave wall that stands for a concept. This doesn't sound revolutionary until you realize what it lets you do. It lets you talk about things that aren't there. You can talk about yesterday, about next season, about a place over the hill that you've never seen but someone told you about. You can share plans, coordinate actions, build agreement. You can lie. You can tell stories. You can create myths that tie groups together, that give them shared identity and purpose. Language, complicated, fully structured language, is part of this. And the growth of language is itself a mystery. We know humans have the body parts for it. Our voice boxes, our tongues, our brains, all are shaped in ways that help speech. But when did language become complicated enough to carry abstract ideas? When did it move from simple calls and hand signals to the kind of building and creating system we use now? There's no fossil proof for language. It doesn't last, but there are clues. The showing up of symbolic stuff is one. Beads, red and yellow pigments, cave paintings, carved figures. These things start showing up in the archaeological record around 70,000 years ago in Africa and 40,000 years ago in Europe. Not everywhere, not consistently, but enough to suggest something had changed. People were making objects that had no practical use, that existed purely to carry meaning, status, identity, belief. This is symbolic culture, and it seems to speed up over time. By the time we reach the end of the last ice age, symbolic expression is everywhere. Art, ritual, burial ways, trade in exotic materials. All signs of a mind that thinks in symbols, that can hold multiple ideas in working memory, that can plan, abstract, and come up with new things. But symbolic thinking alone doesn't explain civilization. Lots of cultures had rich symbolic lives without building cities or making writing. So there's another piece, social thinking. The ability to deal with complicated social networks, to understand what others are thinking, to work together with strangers based on shared rules. Humans are unusual in our ability for large-scale working together. Most primates can work together in small groups, but we can work together with thousands or even millions of people we've never met based on shared beliefs, laws, money, and institutions. This needs a theory of mind, the ability to model what others know and believe. It needs trust, which is often based on reputation and shared cultural stories. And it needs flexibility, the ability to change roles, to do specific things, to give in to authority in some situations while being independent in others. Some researchers argue that the key thinking shift was in working memory, the ability to hold and work with multiple pieces of information at the same time. This is what lets you plan a complicated task like building a house or organizing a hunt where you need to keep track of many things, many people, many what-ifs. Others point to delayed gratification, the ability to give up quick rewards for future benefits. This is important for farming. You plant seeds now. You wait months. You harvest later. If you can't delay gratification, you eat the seeds. No crops. No farming, no civilization. Likely it wasn't one thing. It was a bunch of thinking abilities, each making the others stronger, creating a feedback loop that let humans build more and more complicated societies. And once that loop started, it was hard to stop. Knowledge could pile up. New ideas could spread. Each generation didn't have to start from scratch. They could build on what came before. This is cumulative culture, and is probably the most important feature of human thinking. Not that we're smarter than other animals in every way, but that we can pass on what we learn, make it better, and hand it to the next generation in a better form. But if humans had these thinking abilities for tens of thousands of years, why did civilization take so long? If we were capable of symbolic thought, language, and social working together 50,000 years ago, why didn't we start farming and building cities then? The answer seems to lie not in our minds but in the world around. U.S. climate is a huge part of the story. For most of human history, the climate was unstable. The last ice age, which lasted from about 110,000 years ago to about 11,700 years ago, was not a time of steady cold. It was broken up by quick swings, sudden warming events followed by drops back into icy conditions. In such an environment, long-term planning is risky. Planting crops in one spot makes no sense if the climate might shift big time in a few decades, turning good land into desert or frozen ground. Moving was the safer plan. Follow the resources. Adapt to changing conditions. Don't commit to any one place. But around 11,700 years ago, something amazing happened. The climate got stable. The Holocene epoch began. This is the period we're still in today. And compared to what came before, it's been really stable. Temperatures have moved around. Yes. There have been droughts and cold snaps, but nothing like the wild swings of the Ice Age. This stability made a window. Suddenly, it made sense to put time into one place, to plant crops and expect they'd grow, to build structures and expect they'd still be useful next season, to pile up resources without fearing that the environment would betray you. The Fertile Crescent, where farming first took hold, was really well suited to this new climate. Wild grains grew a lot. Water was available from rivers and seasonal rains. The landscape supported both wild game and eventually tameable animals. It was a kind of Goldilocks zone, not too harsh, not too easy, just challenging enough to reward new ideas without punishing it too badly. But climate alone doesn't explain everything. There's also population pressure. As the climate warmed and got stable, groups grew. More people meant more mouths to feed, which put pressure on wild resources. In some places, this pressure may have pushed people toward farming as a way to make more food per piece of land. It's a feedback loop. More people need more food. More food allows more people. And once you're on that treadmill, it's hard to step off. But there's also the question of property and ownership. Hunter-gatherers usually have equal social structures with shared resources. But once you start putting work into land, planting crops, building structures, the idea of ownership becomes important. Who owns the harvest? Who controls the field? This makes new social stuff, new levels, new forms of power. Some researchers argue that the growth of property rights and the ability to defend them was needed before farming. You won't put time into planting if someone else can just take the harvest. This needs not just social rules but enforcement, which needs some level of social organization and possibly the beginnings of leadership or government structures. There's also the possibility that farming was not a choice but a need born of nature changing. As big animals disappeared, possibly because of overhunting or climate change or both, large game became harder to find. People had to shift to smaller, harder to catch animals and more plant-based diets. Managing wild plant patches was a logical step. And from there, growing plants was a short leap. Likely, all these things played a role, being different in importance depending on the place and the specific stuff going on. There was no single cause, no magic bullet, just a coming together of conditions that made farming possible and in some places good. And once it started, even slowly, it made its own momentum. Here's the paradox. When we look at the archaeological record, the change from hunter-gatherer societies to farming civilizations appears sudden. In the big sweep of human history, it happens in an eye blink. But from the view of the people living through it, it was anything but sudden. It was gradual, generational, almost invisible. So why does it look sudden to us? Part of it is what survives. Things made of stone, ceramics, metal, these tend to survive. Wood, leather, fiber, not so much. The material stuff of moving forages leaves little trace. So the archaeological record is tilted towards settled societies which built with lasting materials and left more behind. This makes the illusion of a sharp divide. Before farming, silence. After farming, cities. But in reality, there was a long, messy transition period that's just harder to see. Another thing is squeezing. When you're dealing with timescales of thousands of years, even a slow process looks fast. Farming took maybe 3,000 years to fully develop in the Fertile Crescent. That's 150 generations. From the view of any individual living through it, change would have been slow, almost invisible. Your grandparents might have lived slightly differently than you, but not hugely. Yet, when we squeeze those 3,000 years into a paragraph or a timeline, it looks instant. There's also the exponential nature of cultural change. Early on, new ideas happen slowly. Each one needs time to spread, to be tested, to be improved. But as groups grow and networks expand, the pace picks up. Ideas meet other ideas. Trade routes spread knowledge. People who do specific things appear who can spend time on new ideas. The curve starts to bend upward. What took 1,000 years in the early Neolithic might take 100 years later on. Then 10 years, then 1. We see this speeding up throughout history. From stone tools to bronze took thousands of years. From bronze to iron took centuries. From iron to steel took decades. From steel to silicon took years. The pattern holds. And once you understand this, the seeming suddenness of civilization makes more sense. It didn't happen all at once, but once it started, it sped up in ways that made it seem sudden looking back. And there's a psychological part, too. Humans are pattern finders. We like stories with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. The idea of a Neolithic revolution, a dramatic turning point, is satisfying as a story. It gives us a story, a before and an after, a moment when everything changed. But reality is messier. There was no single revolution. There were many small shifts, many experiments, many dead ends. Some societies tried farming and did well. Others tried it and went back to foraging. Still others never tried it at all, continuing their moving lifestyles into modern times. The big story hides this. Diversity, this being complicated. And yet, despite all the warnings, something did change undeniably hugely. 10,000 years ago, there were no cities, no writing, no states, no big buildings beyond a few weird cases like Göbekli Tepe. 5,000 years ago, there were cities in Mesopotamia with tens of thousands of people. Writing systems, legal codes, trade networks going hundreds of miles, temples rising above the plains. That's real change. And it happened fast, even if not as fast as it sometimes looks. The question is not whether it happened, but what made it possible. And the answer more and more seems to be that it wasn't any one thing. It was a coming together. The right thinking abilities made over tens of thousands of years. The right environmental conditions, stable climate, lots of resources, the right social stuff, working together, property, leadership, and the right timing. The moment when all these things lined up, that lining up didn't happen everywhere at once. It happened in pockets, in places where the conditions were just right. And from those pockets, the new way of life spread. Sometimes through moving, sometimes through copying, sometimes through taking over. And once it started spreading, it was hard to stop because settled farming societies could support larger groups, could make extra stuff, could do specific jobs, and come up with new ideas in ways that moving foragers could not. Not because farmers were smarter or better, but because the structure of their society allowed for different possibilities. And in the long run, those possibilities added up into what we now call civilization. So here we are all these thousands of words later, and maybe we're no closer to a single clean answer, but maybe that's the point. The question of why civilization showed up so suddenly, or why it showed up at all, doesn't have a simple answer because it wasn't a simple process. It was layered, depending on things, shaped by biology and climate and culture and chance. What we can say is this. For most of human history, we were capable but not turned on. We had the equipment, the brains, the bodies, the possibility, but we didn't have the software or the conditions or the need to build complicated societies. We lived in a world that rewarded moving, being able to change, small scale working together. And we were good at it. Very good, good enough to survive. Ice ages, moves across continents, big animal deaths, volcanic eruptions, all the chaos the planet threw at us. But then the world changed, the climate got stable. Resources became more predictable. Groups grew and suddenly or gradually, depending on how you measure, a different plan became doable. Settlement, farming, extra stuff, doing specific jobs. And with those changes came new ways of thinking or maybe new showings of old ways of thinking. Symbolic culture grew. Social structures became more complicated. Knowledge piled up across generations. The feedback loops kicked in. More people meant more ideas. More ideas meant more new stuff. More new stuff meant more extra resources. More extra resources meant more people, and on faster and faster. Until we arrived here at a world of cities and satellites and bedtime science channels, all built on the foundation of that first slow shift from foraging to farming, from moving to staying, from surviving to building. None of this was something that had to happen. Other planets, other timelines, other versions of Earth might have gone differently. Intelligence might have shown up and faded, leaving no trace. Or it might never have shown up at all. The fact that it did here, that it led to this, to us, to this moment where you're listening and I'm speaking across time and space through the miracle of recorded thought, that's amazing. Not because we're special in some cosmic sense, but because we're here at all. And maybe the missing link isn't missing after all. Maybe it's just invisible. Not a bone or a tool or a gene, but a threshold, a tipping point. The moment when enough things lined up that a new kind of life became possible. And once it became possible, it became real. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but in enough places. For enough people to change the path of the species. We still carry the old ways with us. The hunter's patience, the gatherer's knowledge of plants, the nomad's ability to change. These things are in us, in our genes, in our instincts. We still respond to open landscapes, to the smell of rain, to the flicker of fire. We still tell stories, still look for meaning, still gather in groups and look for patterns in the chaos. But we also build. We plan, we imagine futures and work toward them. We create things that outlast us. Structures and ideas and institutions that carry forward long after we're gone. And that ability, that drive, that's what makes us what we are. Not better than what came before, just different. And maybe, if we're honest, a little bit strange. Because we're the species that spent 99% of its life doing one thing and then in the blink of an eye did something completely different. And we're still figuring out what that means, what we've gained and what we've lost, what we're building toward, and whether we can keep it going. These are questions for other nights, other slow drifts into thought. For tonight, maybe it's enough to sit with the strangeness of the timing, the wonder of the shift, the quiet amazement of realizing that the world we live in now, the one with roads and books and electric lights, is only a few hundred generations away from the world of campfires and stone tools. That's not very long, and yet it's everything. But this process, this change from wild harvesting to full taming took time, an enormous amount of time. And it wasn't a smooth or something that had to happen path. People didn't wake up one morning and decide to become farmers. They didn't knowingly choose to give up the ways of their ancestors. Instead, they made small decisions season by season, generation by generation. Maybe this year we'll stay a little longer near this bunch of wild grain. Maybe we'll plant some of these seeds over there where the dirt looks good. Maybe we'll keep a few of these young goats instead of eating them all. Small choices each. One seeming not important at the time, but piling up over centuries into a totally different way of life. And throughout this change, people were still foraging. They were still hunting. They were still relying heavily on wild resources. Farming wasn't an all-or-nothing thing. For thousands of years, it was just one plan among many, one piece of a diverse way of getting food. People played it safe. They planted some crops, but they also tracked the movements of wild herds. They kept some animals, but they also gathered wild plants. They built more permanent structures, but they still moved seasonally, following resources, keeping connections to the old ways. This mixed way makes sense when you think about the risks. Early farming was unreliable. Crops could fail because of drought, bugs, sickness, or simple bad luck. Wild harvests changed, but had been keeping humans alive for hundreds of thousands of years. People knew how to read landscapes, how to find food even when it was scarce. Giving up that knowledge, that skill set, that safety net against failure would have been foolish, so they didn't. They kept one foot in the old world and one in the new, and they stayed that way for a very long time. Scientists see this mixed way clearly in the remains of early farming settlements. Animal bones from both tame and wild species. Grinding stones for processing grain next to sharp points for hunting. Storage pits next to proof of seasonal moving. The change wasn't a break with the past. It was a gradual mixing, a slow shift in the balance between different plans. And that shift happened at different speeds in different places, responding to local conditions, local pressures, local opportunities. In some places, the move to farming was relatively quick, pushed by population pressure or environment change. In others, it was slow, with people keeping mixed ways for thousands of years. And in still others, it never happened at all. Groups that had access to lots of reliable wild resources often saw no need to take up farming. Why would you if the old ways were working perfectly? Well, this raises an interesting question. If farming wasn't clearly better than foraging, if it actually made people's lives harder in many ways, why did it spread? Why did it eventually become the main form of human getting food across most of the planet? The answer lies not in quality of life, but in how many people you can support. Farming systems, for all their faults, can support way more people per piece of land than foraging can. A square kilometer of farmed land can feed dozens or even hundreds of people. The same area of wild landscape might support only a handful of hunter-gatherers. This difference becomes important when groups start to grow, and groups do grow under settled conditions. When people stop moving, when they have access to steady food sources, when baby deaths decrease, because babies aren't being carried long distances and accidents are reduced by staying put, birth rates go up. Women in farming societies tend to have more children spaced closer together than women in moving foraging groups. This is partly because long breastfeeding, which acts as a natural birth control, becomes less needed when you have other foods to give to babies. It's also because settled life simply allows for more pregnancies. You're not constantly on the move. You have shelter. You have community support. So groups grow. And as they grow, they need more food. And farming, despite its bad sides, is the most efficient way to make that food in a tight area. This makes a ratchet effect. Once you've committed to farming, once your population has grown beyond what wild resources can support, you can't easily go back. You're locked in. Farming becomes not a choice, but a need. The only way to feed all those mouths. And as farming groups continue to grow, they expand, moving into new lands, bringing their crops and animals with them, sometimes pushing out or absorbing foraging groups who can't compete with the sheer numbers that farming makes possible. This people advantage meant that farming societies over the long run tended to expand while foraging societies tended to shrink. Not because farmers were better people or because farming was a better way of life, but simply because farmers could have more children who survived to adulthood. And those children needed land. And that land came from somewhere. Often it came from the territories of hunter-gatherers who found themselves pushed to the edges, to lands that weren't good for farming, to places that farming couldn't reach. Over thousands of years, this process changed the human landscape. By 5,000 years ago, farming was set up across huge chunks of Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas. Farming villages dotted river valleys and plains. Groups were way bigger than they'd been during the Stone Age. And with those larger groups came new challenges, new opportunities, new forms of social organization, because you can't have 1,000 people living in one place and organize them. The same way you organize a band of 30. The social ways that worked for small groups don't scale up. New structures were needed. New levels, new methods of getting people to work together in control. And so alongside farming, we see the showing up of social separation, of special roles, of leadership structures that go beyond the informal influence of respected elders. We see the beginnings of what we would recognize as political organization, of institutions that can make decisions and enforce them across large groups of people who may not all know each other personally. And here's where things get really interesting, because the archaeological record shows that these social changes didn't always follow farming smoothly or in a way that had to happen. There were experiments. There were dead ends. There were societies that made complicated social levels without farming, like the cultures of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, who built fancy ranked societies based on fishing and foraging in a really rich environment. There were farming societies that stayed relatively equal for thousands of years, fighting against the forming of permanent levels. There were places where big buildings showed up before farming, like Göbekli Tepe, and there were places where farming came first and big buildings came later. The order changed. The path was not set ahead of time. What seems clear is that humans were trying out different forms of social organization, different ways of living together in larger groups, different plans for managing resources and solving conflicts and creating meaning. Some of these experiments worked in the sense that they lasted and spread. Others failed, leaving only traces in the archaeological record. And the ones that worked, that survived and did well, tended to be the ones that could use the productive potential of farming while also making the social ways needed to organize and get large groups working together. By around 5000 BCE, we start to see the showing up of what scientists call complex societies. These are communities with several clear features, large groups often numbering in the thousands, permanent settlements with big buildings, social separation with clear differences in status and wealth, special jobs with some people farming, others making pottery, others working metal, others serving as priests or administrators, and central authority with leaders who can command resources and work on a big scale. These complex societies showed up in multiple places around the world, each following its own path, but showing these common features. In Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, villages grew into towns and towns into cities. By 3500 BCE, Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, had a population of maybe 50,000 people. It had huge temples built on raised platforms, workshops for crafts, watering systems to support farming in a dry climate, and administrative centers where scribes kept records on clay tablets. This was city living, the city as a new form of human settlement, a bunch of people and resources and power unlike anything that had existed before. And it spread within a few centuries. Other cities showed up across Mesopotamia. Lagash, Eridu, each with its own temples, its own walls, its own identity. And with these cities came writing, made initially as a tool for keeping records, but soon expanding to encode laws, literature, and history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, comes from this world, from these first cities, from this moment when humans were still figuring out what it meant to live together in such numbers, such closeness, such being. Complicated. Similar processes were happening in other parts of the world, each with its own character, its own new ideas. In the Nile Valley, farming villages came together into larger settlements and eventually into a unified kingdom under the rule of pharaohs. The pyramids, those amazing buildings that still stand out in the landscape at Giza, were built around 2500 BCE as tombs for kings, proofs of the organizing ability of the early Egyptian state, to its ability to get thousands of workers working for projects that serve thinking purposes rather than practical purposes. In the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro came up around 2600 BCE with fancy city planning, grid-pattern streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures, suggesting a level of office organization that was amazing for its time. In China, along the Yellow River, the Shang dynasty appeared around 1600 BCE, bringing with it bronze metalworking, fancy ritual vessels, and the earliest known Chinese writing carved on oracle bones used for fortune-telling. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization came up around 1200 BCE, creating huge stone heads, making a calendar system, and laying the groundwork for the later Maya and Aztec societies. In each case, the pattern is similar. Farming gives the food. Base. Groups grow. Settlements become permanent and expand. Social separation appears. Special roles grow. Authority becomes central. Big buildings show up. Writing or other complicated symbol systems are invented to encode information, keep records, and make power seem right. These are the signs of civilization, and they showed up separately in multiple places across the globe, suggesting that they represent not some unique cultural invention, but a repeating pattern, a predictable outcome when certain conditions are met. But what's fascinating is the diversity within that pattern. Egyptian civilization was not the same as Mesopotamian civilization, even though both were based on river valley farming and both made cities writing and central states. The Indus Valley civilization seems to have been less warlike, less obviously ranked than its time mates in Mesopotamia and Egypt, with fewer big buildings to individual rulers and more proof of planned equal city design. Chinese civilization grew in relative isolation, creating its own special traditions of writing, government, and deep thinking. Mesoamerican civilizations grew without the wheel for moving stuff, without tamed large animals for work, and yet still built huge pyramids, and created fancy skywatching and math systems. The specific forms that civilization took, the particular gods that people worshipped, the building styles they preferred, the political systems they made, all of these changed enormously. Culture matters, history matters, local environments and local traditions shaped how these societies grew. But beneath that diversity, there's a common thread. All of these civilizations were dealing with the same basic challenge: how to organize large numbers of people in permanent settlements, how to get their work working together, how to manage resources, how to create shared meaning and identity, how to keep order and solve conflicts, and the solutions they made, while culturally specific, show repeating themes. Big buildings to show power and create shared identity. Writing to keep records and send knowledge across time and space. Religious systems to explain the world and make authority seem right. Legal codes to control behavior, military forces to defend territory and show power, trade networks to get resources not available locally. Each of these represents a social way, a way of organizing human activity that makes complicated societies possible. And here's something worth stopping over. All of this growth, all of this being complicated appeared in the span of just a few thousand years. From the first careful experiments with planting seeds to the pyramids of Egypt is about 6,000 years. From Göbekli Tepe to the ziggurats of Ur is about 5,000 years. From the first farming villages to the invention of writing is about 3,000 to 4,000 years depending on the place. These are not long time scales in the context of human life. They are a tiny fraction of the 200,000 years that modern humans have been around. They're the final moments of that squeezed 24-hour day we talked about earlier. The last few minutes where everything suddenly speeds up and the speeding up continues. Once writing shows up, once cities are set up, once states appear with the ability to organize work on a huge scale, the pace of change gets faster. Bronze metal working grows. Then iron math becomes more fancy. Skywatching appears as a regular study. Deep thinking begins to ask basic questions about existence, right and wrong, and knowledge. Literature grows. Art becomes more fancy, more self-aware. Trade networks expand, connecting distant places, spreading ideas and ways of doing things. Empires rise, conquering and bringing together territories, creating political units way larger than anything that existed before. And all of this happens within a few thousand years, a period that seems long in human terms, but is incredibly brief in the context of our species' history. This raises the question we started with, now from a different angle. Why did it take so long to start? And why did it speed up so quickly once it began? We've explored many of the things that held back the growth of civilization for most of human history. The instability of ice age climates, the scattered nature of resources in foraging ways, the lack of tameable plants and animals in many places, the small size of human groups, the lack of the social ways needed to get large groups working together. But what about the speeding up? What explains the rapid pace of change once the change began? Part of the answer is simply math. Small numbers grow slowly, large numbers grow quickly. When you have a population of 100 people, adding 10 more is a 10% increase. When you have a population of 10,000, adding 1,000 is only a 10% increase. But it's 1,000 actual people, each with their own knowledge, their own ideas, their own ability for new stuff. As groups grew, the actual number of people who could add new ideas grew as well. More people meant more ideas meant more new stuff. More new stuff meant more productivity meant more people. The feedback loop makes itself stronger, speeding up over time. There's also the thing of being connected. Small isolated groups come up with new ideas slowly. Each group has to figure things out on its own, and new ideas stay local. But as groups grew and became more settled, as trade networks grew, as people moved between places carrying ideas with them, new ideas could spread. A way made in one village could be copied by neighboring villages. A crop tamed in one place could be carried to another. Metal-working knowledge could flow along trade routes. Writing systems could be changed and modified by different cultures. This spreading of new ideas meant that societies didn't have to invent everything themselves. They could borrow, change, and build on the work of others. And as the networks grew thicker, as more societies came into contact with one another, the pace of new ideas increased. Knowledge was no longer stuck in small pockets. It was flowing, mixing, recombining in ways that created new possibilities. This is cumulative culture working at scale, and it's really powerful. Each generation doesn't just build on the knowledge of their parents. They build on the knowledge of multiple societies, multiple traditions, multiple ways of solving problems. Then there's doing specific jobs. In a small foraging band, everyone needs to be a jack of all trades. You need to know how to hunt, how to gather, how to make tools, how to read the landscape. There's little room for people who do just one thing. But in a large farming settlement with extra food and stable groups, doing specific jobs becomes possible. Some people can focus on farming. Others can become potters, spending their time to getting really good at ceramic ways. Others can work metal, trying out different mixes and methods. Still others can become scribes, making writing and keeping records, or priests, working out religious systems, or architects designing buildings, or administrators managing resources and work. Each person who does one specific job can grow deep knowledge in their area, pushing the limits of what's possible in ways that jacks of all trades never could. And the new ideas of people with specific jobs feed back into the broader society, raising productivity, making new forms of activity possible, creating new niches for other people with specific jobs. The division of work, as economists would later call it, is a powerful engine of new ideas and growth. And it needs the kind of large, stable, extra stuff producing societies that farming made possible. There's also the role of storage in keeping things. Foragers live in the present. They eat what they gather or hunt with limited ability to store food for long times. Their knowledge is stored in memory and passed orally, which is powerful, but also breakable. When an elder dies, some knowledge dies with them. But farming societies make ways for keeping things. Grain storage buildings to store grain, pottery to hold liquids and keep foods, and eventually writing to store knowledge outside of human memory, to record it in forms that could survive the death of individuals, that could be copied and sent across generations and across distances. This meant that knowledge could pile up more reliably. Discoveries made in one generation didn't have to be found again in the next. They could be written down, studied, built upon. The invention of writing in particular was transforming. It let people write down laws, making sure of sameness and reducing reliance on memory. It made keeping economic records possible, supporting more and more complicated trade and tax systems. It let people record history, giving societies a sense of their own past, their own continuity. It made possible literature, deep thinking, and science. Areas of questioning that need the ability to build arguments, keep observations, and have debates that span generations. Writing didn't just record knowledge. It changed how people thought, making new forms of reasoning possible, new ways of organizing information, new possibilities for piling up learning. And there's a psychological thing as well, though this is harder to measure. Once people could imagine a different future, once they could see that change was possible, that new ideas could improve their lives or solve their problems, the appetite for change increased. Early farming societies were still very traditional, in many ways with most knowledge passed down through watching and copying. But as cities grew, as trade expanded, as people from different cultures came into contact, as wealth and status became tied to new ideas and risk-taking, they grew. A culture of new ideas, a sense that things could be different, that the future didn't have to look like the past. This mindset, this openness to change, became self-making stronger. Societies that valued new ideas attracted people with new ideas. They rewarded trying new things. They created institutions, markets, guilds, schools that supported and spread new ideas. And the more new ideas happened, the more normal it became, the more it was expected and encouraged. We see this pattern throughout history. Times of rapid new ideas often happen in places where diverse cultures come together, where trade is doing well, where there's wealth to support trying new things, where there's competition that rewards new solutions. Classical Athens, Han Dynasty China, the Islamic Golden Age, Renaissance Italy. Each of these times and places saw explosive creativity. Not because the people were basically different from their ancestors, but because the conditions supported and encouraged new ideas in ways that earlier times had not. But let's not romanticize this process too much. The rise of civilization wasn't all good. In fact, for many individuals, the change from foraging to farming to city life brought real hardships. We've already mentioned the health costs, the drop in food quality, and the increase in sickness. But there were social costs as well. Inequality grew. In foraging societies, status differences exist, but are usually quiet. Leadership is informal, based on respect rather than force. Resources are shared. But in farming and city societies, wealth could be piled up and passed down through generations. Classes appeared upper and lower with very different qualities of life. Slavery showed up, the owning of one human being by another in many early civilizations. Women's status often dropped with the shift to farming. And settled life as inheritance of property became important, and women's baby-making ability was controlled more tightly. Fighting became more organized and more deadly as groups grew, as resources became bunched up, as states appeared with the ability to field armies and build walls. The archaeological record from early farming societies shows proof of violence on a scale not seen in the Stone Age. Mass graves, walled settlements, skeletal remains showing injuries from weapons. This doesn't mean that foragers were peaceful. They weren't necessarily. Violence has always been part of human life. But the scale and organization of violence changed with civilization, and not for the better. There's also the question of freedom. Foragers, for all the challenges of their lifestyle, had a kind of independence that farming peoples often lost. They could move if conditions became bad. They could leave a group if conflicts came up. They were not tied to land, to property, to institutions. But farmers were. Once you've put in years clearing land, planting orchards, building a house, you can't just walk away. You're committed. And as societies grew larger and more complicated, as states appeared, individual independence dropped further. You were subject to laws, to taxes, to being forced into work or military service. You were part of a larger system that controlled many parts of your life. For some people, this was fine. The benefits of security, of community, of being part of something larger than themselves outweighed the costs. But for others, it was crushing. And the archaeological and historical records keep hints of resistance, of people running from state control, of communities carefully staying outside the orbit of civilization, keeping foraging or herding lifestyles in edge areas where state power couldn't reach. The anthropologist James C. Scott has argued that we should think of these peoples not as primitive or backward, but as actively choosing a different way of life, keeping freedoms and independence that their farming and city neighbors had given up. So the rise of civilization was not a simple story of progress, of humanity climbing from darkness into light. It was a complicated, messy, morally unclear process that brought both benefits and costs, that created new possibilities while closing others, that solved some problems while creating new ones. And the people living through it, the thousands of generations who slowly, bit by bit, transformed human life from moving foraging to settled farming to city civilization. They didn't have a master plan. They weren't trying to create cities or states or writing. They were just trying to live, to survive, to provide for their families, to find meaning and safety in an uncertain world. The decisions they made, the changes they chose, the new ideas they came up with were responses to immediate stuff going on, to local challenges, to opportunities that showed themselves. And the piling up effect of all those small decisions made by millions of people over thousands of years was a change in the human condition so deep that we're still trying to understand it, still dealing with its results, still figuring out what it means to be human in a world so totally different from the one our ancestors lived in for most of our life. And here's a thought that might be worth sitting with for a moment. We tend to think of ourselves, of modern humans, as the end result of this process, as the finish line of this long journey from forager to farmer to city person to factory worker to whatever we are now in this digital globalized age. But we're not a finish line. We're just the latest chapter. The process of change, of adapting, of new ideas is still going on. The world we live in now would be as impossible to recognize to someone from an early farming village as that village would be to a Stone Age forager. And the world 100 years from now or 1,000 will likely be equally impossible to recognize to us. We're not the finish line. We're somewhere in the middle of a story whose end we cannot see, and that's both humbling and exciting. Humbling, because it reminds us that we're not as special as we might like to think, that we're part of a process larger and longer than ourselves. Exciting because it means the story's not over, that there are still possibilities ahead, still changes to come, still ways of being human that we haven't yet discovered or invented. The missing link in human history, the invisible threshold we cross somewhere between the Ice Age and the Bronze Age, between foraging and farming, between moving and staying. That link is not a fixed point. It's a process. It's still happening. We're still changing not just biologically, but culturally, socially, with technology. We're still figuring out what it means to be human, what our abilities are, what our limits might be. Think about the pace of change in just the last few centuries. The farming revolution we've been talking about took thousands of years. The factory revolution took about 150 years. The digital revolution has taken about 50. Each change is happening faster than the last, and each one is changing basic parts of how we live, how we work, how we talk, how we understand ourselves. We're in the middle of changes so rapid and so deep that it's hard to get perspective on them. Hard to see the pattern when you're inside it. But future historians, if there are any, will look back on our time the way we look back on the Neolithic, and they'll ask similar questions. Why then? What triggered the shift? What were the conditions that made it possible? What did people lose and what did they gain? Were they aware of what was happening? Did they choose it, or were they swept along? And they might conclude, as we have about the Neolithic, that it wasn't any one thing. It was a coming together of things, technological and environmental, and social and cultural, that lined up in ways that made a new mode of life possible, and once possible, somehow had to happen. They might see patterns we can't see because we're too close. They might understand results we can only guess at. They might wonder, as we do about Göbekli Tepe, at the big buildings we've left behind, trying to decode what they meant to us, what they say about what we valued and feared and hoped for. But here's the difference. The people who built Göbekli Tepe didn't leave written records. We have to guess at their intentions, their beliefs, their experience. We're doing it right now, you and I, leaving detailed records of this moment, this change we're living through. Future historians won't have to guess as much. They'll have archives, databases, billions of documents and images and recordings. They'll be able to see in exhaustive detail what we thought, what we worried about, what we created. Whether that will make their job easier or harder, I don't know. Sometimes too much information is as challenging as too little. But the point is, we're self-aware in a way that previous generations weren't necessarily. We know we're in the middle of something. We can see the speeding up. We can feel the disruption. We can measure the changes. And we can ask, as we've been asking tonight, why? How did we get here? What does it mean? And more importantly, what do we do with this awareness? Because that's the real question, isn't it? Not just understanding the past, but understanding it in ways that help us find our way through the present and imagine the future. The missing link in human history, the threshold that our ancestors crossed. That moment when everything changed. It can teach us something about this moment, this threshold we might be crossing now. It can remind us that change, even dramatic disruptive change, is not something new. That humans have found their way through deep changes before. That we have within us the ability to adapt, to come up with new ideas, to reorganize our societies and our lives in response to new stuff happening. But it can also remind us that these changes come with costs, that progress is not something that has to happen or always helpful, that the choices we make now will shape the world for generations or centuries to come. The people who first planted seeds didn't know they were starting a revolution. They were just trying to have enough to eat. The people who built the first cities didn't know they were creating a new form of human organization that would spread across the world. They were just trying to create order, safety, meaning in their lives. The people who invented writing didn't know they were creating a way of doing things that would transform human awareness itself. They were just trying to keep track of grain, supplies. None of them could see the full results of what they were doing. We can't either. The ways of doing things we're making, the systems we're building, the changes we're making to the planet itself, they'll have results we can't fully predict. Some of those results will be helpful. Others might be terrible. Most will probably be some mix of both. And future generations will have to live with the results of choices we're making now. Choices that might seem reasonable or needed or had to happen from our view, but that might look very different from theirs. So what do we take from all this? What's the lesson if there is one? Maybe it's simply that being human means living with not knowing, with change, with the knowledge that the ground beneath us is never as solid as it seems. Maybe it's that the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from matters. That understanding our past helps us make sense of our present and imagine our future. Maybe it's that we're not the first to face seemingly impossible challenges, to find our way through deep changes, to wonder if we're equal to the task ahead. Our ancestors faced their own impossibilities. Climate chaos, resource shortage, population pressure, social upheaval, and they survived. Not all of them, not everywhere, not without cost, but they survived. They adapted. They came up with new ideas. They found ways to live that hadn't existed before. And maybe, just maybe, that ability is still in us. Not guaranteed to succeed, not without the possibility of failure, but they're waiting like it waited. For tens of thousands of years before conditions lined up and everything suddenly finally began to change. We are the children of people who crossed thresholds, who adapted to new realities, who built worlds different from anything their ancestors could have imagined. We carry their toughness in our genes, their cleverness in our cultures, their stories, in our myths and memories, and we're crossing our own thresholds now. Facing our own changes, building our own never-before worlds. Whether we do it wisely or, well, whether we create something worth passing on to our children. That's the question. We're living inside right now. That's the story we're writing with our choices, our actions, our responses to the challenges of this moment. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it's enough to know that we're part of something larger, something that started long before us and will continue long after, that we're not alone in this. Not the first to wonder and worry and hope. That the ability for change, for transformation, for crossing thresholds that seem impossible until suddenly they're not. That ability is basically human. It's what we do. It's what we've always done. From the first person who looked at a pile of seeds and imagined a field to the first person who stacked stones and imagined a building to the first person who made marks and imagined writing to whoever is making the next leap. Right now, somewhere imagining something we can't yet see. The missing link was never missing. It was always there in the tension between what is and what might be, in the gap between ability and showing. In the moment when conditions line up and the impossible becomes real. We've crossed that threshold before. We're crossing it again now. And we'll cross it again in the future if we have one. That's the pattern. That's the story. That's what it means to be human in a world that never stops changing, never settles, never quite lets us rest. And maybe in our own small way, that's exactly what we're doing right now, you and I, in this quiet moment before sleep. Crossing a threshold. Not a big one, not a civilization one, just the threshold between waking and sleeping, between thought and dream, between the questions that keep us up and the rest that lets us face another day. We've traveled a long way tonight through deep time and big questions. We've watched our ancestors move from stone tools to cities, from spoken traditions to written records, from survival to civilization. We've seen the patterns, the feedback, loops, the thresholds. We've asked why it took so long and why it happened so fast. And maybe we found some answers or at least some better questions. Thanks for being here for this journey. Thanks for following these threads through the maze of human history. Thanks for sitting with the not knowing, the being complicated, the strange and wonderful timing of it all. If something here connected, if a question caught your interest, if you found yourself thinking in new ways about where we came from and where we might be going, I'd be grateful if you'd share this with others who might appreciate it. That's how knowledge spreads. How ideas find their way through the world, one mind to another, one conversation at a time. It's how humans have always learned, always grown, always crossed the next threshold together. The questions will still be here tomorrow. The mysteries will still be waiting, and so will the next threshold, whatever it might be. For now, let your mind rest. Let the thoughts settle. Let yourself drift into whatever comes next, knowing that you're part of this long, strange, beautiful story of a species that learned to ask questions and never quite learned to stop. Sleep well. Good night. But before we let sleep claim us completely, before we release these questions into the dark, there's one more thread worth following, One more pattern worth noticing in this big picture of human change. We've talked about climate and farming, about symbolic thinking and social organization, about the coming together of things that made civilization possible. But there's something else woven through all of this, something harder to pin down, but maybe just as important. It's the rule of belief itself, the power of shared stories, the way humans create meaning, and how that meaning in turn creates reality. Think about Göbekli Tepe again. Why did people build it? We don't know for certain, but the most convincing explanations go around belief, around the creation of sacred space, around the need to mark a place as special, meaningful, set apart from the regular world. This wasn't practical. It wasn't about shelter or defense or storing food. It was about meaning, about creating a physical showing of ideas that existed only in people's minds, about transforming invisible beliefs into visible, touchable reality. And the effort needed was huge. Hundreds or thousands of people working together over decades or centuries, getting stone from quarries, carving pillars, putting up big buildings that served no survival purpose, but that clearly mattered intensely to those who built them. This suggests something deep about human nature. We don't just need food and water and safety. We need meaning. We need to believe that our lives are part of something larger, that our actions matter, that the world makes sense in ways that go beyond the immediate and the physical. And we're willing to put huge resources, huge effort in creating and keeping those beliefs. This is uniquely human as far as we can tell. Other animals don't build temples. They don't create art that has no practical purpose. They don't gather in thousands to celebrate shared myths, but humans do. We've always done it. And it might be one of the key things that made civilization possible. Because here's the thing, large-scale working together, the kind needed for cities and states and complicated societies, depends basically on shared belief. When you have 30 people in a band, you can work together through personal relationships. Everyone knows everyone. Trust is based on direct experience. Reputation is immediate and seeable. But when you have 3,000 people or 30,000, most of whom have never met each other, you need something else. You need shared stories, shared beliefs, shared symbols that create a sense of common identity and common purpose. You need to believe that you and all those strangers are part of the same community, bound by the same rules, working toward the same goals. And those beliefs, those shared stories, they're not natural. They're built. They're imagined. They're what the historian Yuval Noah Harari calls intersubjective realities. Things that exist only because we together believe they exist. Money is an intersubjective reality. It has value only because we all agree it has value. A piece of paper is just a piece of paper until we together decide it's worth something, that it can be traded for goods or services. The same is true of nations, of corporations, of laws, of all the institutions that structure modern life. They exist because we believe they exist, because we act as if they're real. And in acting as if they're real, we make them real. This ability to create and live in shared fictions, shared stories, shared realities that exist in the realm of belief, rather than the realm of physical stuff. This might be the most specially human thinking ability. And it might be the missing link we've been looking for, the invisible thing that made civilization possible. Because farming alone doesn't explain cities. Plenty of farming societies stay, small scale and equal for thousands of years. What cities need in addition to extra food is the ability to organize large numbers of people who don't all know each other personally. And that needs shared belief systems, shared stories that create identity and duty and meaning. Early cities were often organized around temples, around gods, around cosmic stories that explained who people were and why they mattered and what they owed to each other and to the powers that governed the universe. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia weren't just buildings. They were cosmic mountains, earthly showings of the sacred, places where heaven and earth met. The pharaohs of Egypt weren't just political leaders. They were living gods, bodies of divine order, key pieces holding the universe together. These beliefs from our modern view might seem like superstition or fantasy, but they were essential to the working of these societies. They gave the framework within which working together made sense, within which authority could be made to seem right, within which individuals could find their place and purpose. Without these shared stories, these group fictions, it's hard to see how early cities could have worked. Why would you obey laws if you didn't believe in the authority of those making the laws? Why would you pay taxes if you didn't believe you were part of a larger community with shared duties? Why would you give your work to building big buildings if you didn't believe those buildings were meaningful, sacred, important? The physical benefits of city life were often questionable, especially for those at the bottom of the social ladder. What made people put up with the inequality, the hard work, the limits on freedom was belief. Belief that this was how the world should be. Belief that the social order reflected cosmic order. Belief that their suffering had meaning, that it served purposes larger than themselves. Now, this is a double-edged observation. On one hand, it highlights the amazing power of human imagination, our ability to create complicated social realities through shared belief. On the other hand, it reveals how easily that power can be used wrongly, how belief systems can be used to justify inequality, to keep oppressive structures going, to convince people to accept conditions that serve the interests of leaders rather than the common good. And we see this tension throughout history, belief systems that create sticking together and meaning and allow for large-scale working together, but that also often make levels stronger and limit freedom and channel human possibility and directions decided by those in power. The question then and now is whether it's possible to have the benefits of shared belief, the getting people working together and sense of meaning it makes possible without the costs, without the crushing and using that so often come with it. And that's a question we're still working on. We've made different kinds of shared stories over time, from the religious stories of early civilizations to the political ideas of nation states to the economic stories of capitalism to the scientific stories that now structure much of how we understand the world. Each of these represents a different kind of shared belief system, a different way of creating intersubjective reality, of organizing working together around ideas rather than just around kinship or personal relationships. And each has its own strengths and weaknesses, its own ways of creating meaning, and its own potential for abuse. What's interesting is that the most successful societies, the ones that have done well and spread and shaped the world, have often been those that were best at creating convincing stories, at imagining shared realities that people wanted to be part of. The Roman Empire succeeded not just through military might, but through a powerful story of Roman identity, Roman law, Roman civilization as the peak of human achievement. The great religions spread not through force alone, but through stories that offered meaning, community, salvation, answers to the deepest human questions. Modern democracy, for all its flaws, succeeds where it does because of the story it offers. The belief in human rights and equality in government by permission of the governed. These are fictions in the sense that they're not written into the fabric of the universe. They're human creations kept going by group belief. But they're powerful fictions, world-shaping fictions, and in their power, they become as real as anything touchable. This brings us to an interesting paradox. The more we understand about how these shared stories work, the more we see them as built rather than given, as imagined rather than discovered, the harder it becomes to believe in them wholeheartedly. Once you see the mechanism, once you understand that money only has value because we agree it does, that nations are imagined communities rather than natural things, that laws are human inventions rather than cosmic truths, it's hard to keep the same unquestioning belief. And yet we still need these shared stories to work. We still need to believe at some level in the systems and institutions and ideas that structure our lives. This is the modern condition, maybe living with the awareness that our social realities are built, that our shared stories are fictional, while at the same time needing to act as if they're real, to take part in them, to keep them going. Because without them, we'd have no way to work together. No framework for working together, no basis for meaning beyond the individual in the immediate. And maybe this brings us full circle to where we started. To the question of the missing link, the threshold our ancestors crossed, the moment when everything changed. Maybe what changed wasn't any single thing. Not farming or climate or symbolic. Thinking alone, but the interaction of all these things with this uniquely human ability for shared belief, for creating group fictions powerful enough to reshape reality itself. Our ancestors learned to imagine things that didn't exist and then to act as if they did exist until through group action and belief they brought them into being. They imagined fields before there were fields and then created them. They imagined cities before there were cities and then built them. They imagined gods and laws and nations and money and writing and all the invisible infrastructures of civilization, and then they made them real through belief and action and the slow piling up of shared practice over generations. This is what makes humans different. Not intelligence alone, though we are smart. Not language alone, though language is really important. Not tool use or social working together or any single thing. But the combination of all these things with the ability to create and live in shared stories, to build worlds out of words, to transform belief into reality through group action. And we're still doing it right now, all around us. The world we live in is largely a product of shared belief. The value of money, the rightness of governments, the authority of science, the meaning of art, all of these depend on group agreement, on shared stories that we keep going through our taking part in them. And new stories are being created all the time. New ways of organizing, working together, new frameworks for meaning, new shared realities appearing from the digital networks that now connect us across the planet. Whether these new stories, these new forms of shared belief will lead to doing well or disaster, whether they'll expand human possibility or hold it back, whether they'll create more equality or more levels, we don't know yet. We're inside the process. We're the ones creating the stories, taking part in them, shaping them through our choices and our beliefs and our actions. And that's both responsibility and opportunity. Because if our social realities are built, if they depend on shared belief rather than inevitable natural law, then they can be rebuilt. Different stories are possible. Different ways of organizing, working together. Different frameworks for meaning. Different visions of what it means to be human and what kind of world we want to create. Our ancestors weren't passive receivers of civilization. They were active takers part in creating it, making choices, adapting to stuff happening, building something new, even when they couldn't see the full shape of what they were building. And we're in the same position now. We can't see the end of the story. We can't know what world we're creating. But we can make choices about what stories we believe in, what systems we support, what kind of future we're working toward. That's the inheritance of that threshold crossing, that missing link in human history. Not just the physical legacy of farming and cities and technology, but the thinking legacy of knowing that worlds are built on belief that reality is bendable, that the future is not set ahead of time, but imagined and then created through group action. It's a strange and powerful inheritance, and what we do with it, how we use this ability to create shared realities will decide what kind of world the next generations get from us. So here we are, thousands of words into this exploring, and maybe the answer to why civilization showed up so suddenly isn't an answer at all. Maybe it's a process, a pattern, a possibility that had always been sleeping in human thinking, but that needed particular conditions to show itself. Maybe it's not about a single missing link, but about multiple things lining up, about feedback loops starting, about thresholds being crossed in order until the pace of change sped up beyond what anyone could have predicted. And maybe we're in a similar moment now with multiple things lining up, feedback loops speeding up, thresholds being crossed, the pace of technology change, the scale of global connectedness, the urgency of environmental crisis, the transformation of work and communication and community. These are conditions as never before as the ones our ancestors faced when the climate got stable and farming became possible. And like them, we're making it up as we go, responding to stuff happening, adapting, coming up with new ideas, trying to create systems and stories and ways of living that make sense in this new reality. We don't know if we'll succeed. They didn't know either. What we have that they didn't is awareness. We can see the pattern. We can study the past and learn from it. We can understand that changes are possible, that humans have found their way through deep changes before, that the ability for adapting and new ideas is built into who we are. But we also know that changes are difficult, that they come with costs, that success is not guaranteed, and that knowledge, that awareness, that ability to see ourselves in the largest sweep of human history, that might be both our greatest advantage and our heaviest burden. Because with awareness comes responsibility. Our ancestors didn't know they were creating civilization. We know we're creating something. We can see it happening. We can measure it, study it, debate it. And that means we have choices they didn't have. We can be careful in ways they couldn't. We can ask not just what's possible, but what's good. Not just how to adapt, but how to adapt wisely. Not just how to survive, but how to create a world worth living in. These are hard questions, harder than anything our ancestors faced because they have the added dimension of awareness, of consciousness, of moral weight. But maybe they're the right questions. Maybe they're the questions that humans need to be asking at thresholds, at moments of change when the old ways are ending and the new ways are not yet clear. And maybe asking them, struggling with them, refusing easy answers or false certainties. Maybe that's the most human thing we can do. To wonder, to question, to imagine possibilities, to create stories and test them and change them and keep reaching towards something better even when we're not sure what better means. That's what our ancestors did in their own way with their own limitations. They reached toward more, toward stability, toward extra stuff, toward lasting, toward meaning, toward being complicated. They didn't always reach wisely. They created levels and inequalities and systems of crushing along with cities and art and writing. But they reached, they tried, they transformed their world and themselves in the process. And we're doing the same. We've gotten their ability for transformation, their ability to create new realities through shared belief and group action. And we've added to it our own tools, our own knowledge, our own awareness. What we create with that inheritance, what world we build on the foundations they laid, that's up to us. That's the story we're writing now. And like all good stories, it's not set ahead of time. It could go many different ways. The ending hasn't been written. We're writing it word by word, choice by choice, belief by belief, and that brings us back to this moment. To you, wherever you are, listening in the dark or the light at the end of the day or the beginning, to this quiet space we've shared, this conversation across time about time, this wondering about how we got here and where we might be going. You're part of this story too, not a passive watcher, but an active taker part. The choices you make, the beliefs you hold, the actions you take, they all add to the larger story. The group reality we're creating together, that's not meant to be a burden. It's just a fact, a recognition of the power and responsibility that comes with being human in this particular moment of human history. You matter. Your story crosses with all the other stories, all the other choices, all the other beliefs that are shaping the world right now and will shape the world that comes after us. And maybe that's the real missing link we've been looking for all along. Not something in the past that explains why civilization showed up suddenly, but something in the present that connects us to that past and to the future. The realizing that we're not separate from history. We're inside it. We're making it. Every moment, every choice, every belief, we're the latest chapter in a story that started long before us and will continue long after. And that chapter, the one we're writing now, it matters just as much as any that came before. Maybe more because we can see the pattern. We can understand the power of shared stories and group action. We can choose with more awareness than any generation before us what kind of world we want to create, what kind of story we want to tell, what kind of inheritance we want to leave. So rest now if you can. Let these questions settle into your bones, into your dreams, into the quiet places where change begins. Let yourself be part of this long, strange, beautiful story of a species that learned to imagine the impossible and then make it real. The questions will still be here in the morning. The story will still be unfolding and you'll still be part of it. carrying forward the legacy of every human who ever looked at the world and imagined it could be different, who crossed the threshold from what was to what might be, who built something new on the foundations of the old. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. That's the missing link. The invisible thread connecting Göbekli Tepe to cities, stone tools to spacecraft, oral tradition to global networks, the ability to imagine and to believe and to act, and to transform reality through the power of shared story and group effort. It was there all along. It's still here now. And it's what will carry us for better or worse across whatever thresholds await. Sleep well, dream big, and remember that you're part of something larger. Something that started long before you and will continue long after. Something that's being created right now through the choices and beliefs and actions of everyone who's ever looked at the world and wondered, what if? What if things could be different? What if we tried? What if we believed? Good night.